The Killing Joke is often in people's top 3 Batman comics of all time. And considering the character's been around for almost 100 years, that's quite impressive. But there's something significantly wrong with this comic that genuinely makes it worse for the audience, and if you make the same mistakes with your comic, your audience is going to feel it too. And you don't have Batman as an IP to fall back on. So what is it that this seminal comic does so badly? In a word, word balloons. So word balloons are probably the most overlooked thing in the entire comic making process. And I have some pretty compelling evidence that the Killing Joke is guilty of doing this too. And the biggest impact this has on the reader is confusion. And that is the one thing you do not want your reader to be: confused. And often this leads to the reader not knowing exactly who is talking until after they've read the dialogue, not before. And that matters a lot more than you might think. And so in this video, we're going to break down some examples of that in the Killing Joke so that you don't make the same mistakes. And if you're new, I'm John, a comic creator from the UK, and you're a comic creator who just wants to finish their comic. And that's exactly what this channel is for, so don't forget to subscribe. Now I want to start with the most common mistake that people make with word balloons, and that is the word balloon tail. There are 2 major mistakes that people make with word balloon tails, and that is that they are either too short or not pointing to the character's mouth. The Killing Joke does this all the time, and it does my head in, even on the front cover. The fundamental reason why your word balloon tails need to be long enough and pointing to the character's mouth is because the audience needs to know who is talking before they read the dialogue. And it's not just important for them to just know, it's important for them to know without even trying. A comic book shouldn't be difficult for the audience to read. The only reason that a comic should be difficult to read is if the themes are challenging, not that the comic itself is challenging. To give you an example of how this might look, the second your audience has to... Sorry, I read that line wrong. The second your audience has to stop the flow, it breaks that immersion. Did I break the immersion or flow of this video by flubbing that line? That's what it's like for your audience when they're reading your comic where the word balloon tail isn't quite long enough and it's not pointing to the character's mouth. It's that slight interruption that's going to hurt the pacing and flow of your comic. Let's take this scene here as an example. The line "I've been thinking lately about you and me" has the word balloon tail pointing towards Batman's knee. It's really annoying because this scene sets everything up for the entire comic book and it's brilliant. Just make the tail slightly longer and have it point more towards where Batman's mouth is. It's really, really easy to fix this. This is the 3rd word balloon of the entire comic, by the way. Here's another example. I just wanted to know that I'd made a genuine attempt to talk things over and avert that outcome. Again, this word balloon is pointing at nothing. It's vaguely gesturing towards Batman. Is it going to ruin the entire comic? No. But when you think about it from the audience's perspective as they're reading it, it's those things that can cause those little stutters and break the pace and the immersion for the reader, because they're constantly having to check, wait, is this Batman talking or is this the Joker talking? The word balloons in general can hurt the visual story exactly because of that reason. But also because of another thing that a lot of comic creators, and probably you as well, do not consider, which is that the word balloons are just as much a part of the composition as the art is. And arguably their impact on the composition and their influence on the composition is actually more than the art. So many comic creators prioritize the art and put the word balloons in as an afterthought. Let me know in the comments if that's you. There's no shame in it, it's exactly what I used to do as well. And I think one of the reasons for that is that a lot of comic creators are primarily artists first and writers second. And so they think in terms of the visuals first and the words second. But that's a problem, because good art with bad word balloons makes a bad comic. Let's look at this panel as an example. I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that The Killing Joke was made in the late 80s. They didn't have the same privileges that I do, where I can just move stuff around the screen and I can press Ctrl-Z. So I want to acknowledge that and show genuine respect, because I do have genuine respect for this comic. It is one of my favorite comic books ever. Because all of that being acknowledged, these 2 panels are a huge mistake. Now, to be clear, the art itself is fantastic. The panel size is great. It fits in that 3x3, that traditional 9-grid page. It's great. Except the word balloon completely crowds this particular composition to the point that this is the only place that it can go. And that to me is a mistake, because when you're forced to put a word balloon in an awkward position, it's oftentimes because of bad compositional choices. And I think these are bad compositional choices, because all of the storytelling is done in the bottom half of these panels with Batman's hands. The Joker is just in the background as background context, I suppose. He doesn't matter as much. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that he really doesn't matter that much, because Bolland arbitrarily moved Joker's hands above his own face because he needed the room for that word balloon, when he could have actually shunted everything over to the right in this empty space here to give this a bit more breathing room if he wanted the word balloon in that location, because it looks very, very cramped. Which you could argue, you could make the compositional argument that they are in a jail cell, so it's supposed to feel claustrophobic. You could make that argument. That's a weak argument in my opinion, but you can make it. There is a way to do this better, in my view, where you can have a more interesting page layout, a slightly more varied page layout, and also much clearer word balloon placement that makes the scene a bit less messy. So let me show you what I mean by that. First of all, we're going to take the first word balloon, that's maybe yours, and put it in panel 7 in this empty space here. So you've got more space to work with, and just do a side shot of Batman in this panel. Because with a side shot of Batman, we can do more acting from him. We don't need to see the Joker. We just need to see Batman's reaction to the Joker. So we can have Batman slowly turning his hand and noticing that there's makeup on his hand, which wouldn't normally happen. And so it helps to build up to that tension in the last panel, which is when he's looking at his hand, or looking at his hand with the makeup on it. And at the same time, you have a lot more room to put this dialogue in, which leads much more beautifully to the end panel of this page, in my opinion. Anyway, with this small change in panel 8, that frees up some space so the visuals have a bit more breathing room, and it doesn't feel like the dialogue and the art are jockeying for attention. And this is why when you're doing your compositions or doing your thumbnails for your comics, that you should very much factor in the word balloons while you're doing that, because then you won't have to do any redraws like I'm doing with The Killing Joke. Obviously, Brian Bolland needs my help. But just imagine that you had spent hours and hours and hours on this page or an equivalent page for your comic, only to realize that there could have been a much better option that not only makes the visual storytelling better, at least in my opinion, but also the composition better as well, and just easier for your audience to read the comic and to enjoy the comic. That's potentially hours wasted that could have been avoided. And that really matters, particularly for us, because let's face it, we don't have much of time or energy to spend on comics. So any way that we can not waste it is a good thing. Now, for those of you who have read this comic, you know that there's quite an infamous scene involving Barbara Gordon. Now, I'm not going to go into the scene itself in detail, but I do want to talk about the word balloons, because I feel that the placement of the word balloons really undercuts the drama of the scene. And this might be the part of the comic that is ruined the most by the bad word balloon placement. Also, spoiler alert incoming, obviously. But before I show you that, I'd love it if you could complete this Google form. It's completely free and anonymous, and I want your opinions because I'm making a comic course next year and I want it to be relevant. So whether you're new to this or you've been making comics for years, I want to hear from you. And if you complete it, there'll be a word balloon related gift for you as thanks, which is kind of appropriate for this video. Now, let's get back to that scene. There are some seriously amazing panel compositions going on in this scene. Gordon and the Goon framing the Joker in the background in panel 3. The Joker casually inspecting his drink as Gordon is being assaulted behind him, where the Joker is obscuring the violence in panel 4. Amazing, it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite panels. It might be my favorite panel in the entire comic, actually, which is why the word balloons for this page in particular really bug me, because I feel that they are detracting away from the fantastic compositions that the art is doing. It really feels like throughout this comic that the word balloons and the art are just fighting each other so much, and that they're almost resisting each other's presence. Like it's the artist versus the writer rather than the artist and the writer. I want to start with panel 3 on this particular page. So the first problem is that the Joker's word balloon tail isn't reaching him. It's resting on this goon's arm. That means when we read the dialogue, we have to figure out who's talking while we're reading it, because the word balloon is small and it's also subtle as well. So we really have to look for the word balloon tail rather than just going straight into the dialogue. That's bad. Do you remember that episode of The Simpsons when Lisa gets the letter from her pen pal and halfway through the voice changes because of the uprising in their country? I'll put it in here.
A president has been overthrown and
replaced by the benevolent General Krull. All hail Krull. Sincerely, little girl.
If it's not in here, it means Disney came for me. Anyway, that's what it's like when you're reading a piece of dialogue, but you're not sure who's talking. I don't know about you, but whenever I read the Joker's dialogue in any comic, I hear Mark Hamill. Every time. In the same way that whenever I read Batman in anything, I hear Kevin Conroy. They're just the voices that are synonymous with those characters. And even characters that haven't been voiced by voice actors, you tend to have different voices in your own head that you create when you're reading comics, based on the character's personality or their build or their whatever. What I don't want to do when I'm reading a comic, especially a comic that involves a character as iconic as the Joker with such a distinct voice profile, I don't want to be reading their dialogue in somebody else's voice and then have to either change it halfway through reading or go back and reread it in their voice. That to me makes the comic worse. It certainly makes the experience of reading and enjoying the story worse, certainly from a character point of view, which is kind of important in comics. And especially when you're in such an intense scene as this one, with a character as evil as the Joker is, this might be the most evil thing he ever does, maybe, certainly to an individual. And if the word balloons kind of undercut that, then it undercuts everything about that scene. So this really is a lot more important than you might have considered otherwise. Now, there's actually a pretty easy fix for this particular word balloon, which is that you just increase the length of the word balloon tail and bend it so it hits Joker's head area. You've got the space for it, so use it. Remember, the word balloon tail doesn't literally need to be pointing at the mouth. It just needs to be pointing as close to the mouth as is reasonable. So if your character's mouth is obscured or if they're turning away from the camera, then just having it around the head is enough, because it's very clear that this person is talking, even though the word balloon tail isn't at their mouth. And maybe this is me being picky here, but I would also consider moving Gordon to the left of the Joker a lot more so that his mouth isn't stacked on top of Joker's head. That's another thing that I noticed about that, because with Gordon's word balloon in particular, it's not necessarily clear that that's Gordon saying yuff, which I guess is the noise you make when you get punched in the stomach. And with our fix of moving Joker's word balloon tail so it bends around to his head, that could also be confusing because it might look like Gordon is saying those words rather than Joker. So if you move Gordon to the left a lot more, you're not stacking that mouth on top of Joker's head, which is a strange thing to say, but you see what I mean. In fact, let me do a really rubbish edit of this to show you what I mean exactly. There you go. That's amazing. So Gordon is still being held back by this goon. You can move the angle of his arm up like that, and you can still show the scissors being dropped and the punch, but it's not quite as on top of Joker. I do appreciate that you lose the framing of Joker. It's not quite as clean and quite as closed as it was, but I think that's a worthwhile trade. Again, a lot of this is going to be down to individual differences, individual opinions, and this is just mine. Anyway, the next panel shows us a great example of a really simple fix to these two word balloons, which this comic just doesn't do for some reason. I don't know why. It would make things so much easier, so much less complicated, so much less cluttered, which is to connect two word balloons using a tail. Rather than having two word balloons side by side or next to each other when it's the same person talking, having two word balloon tails like that, you just have one word balloon tail and then the second word balloon tail connects to the word balloon. It's so much cleaner and easier to see it that way, and they just don't do that. And I'm not sure why, because they do it here, in this panel here with Barbara, but they don't do it anywhere else. So this panel here, you've got the top line here, God, these literary discussions are so dry. So this bit of dialogue, and please do be careful, after all, he is topping the bill. Now, I don't like this word balloon because it's pointing towards Gordon's knee, which is just annoying. But you wouldn't need that word balloon tail at all if you just connect these two here. It doesn't matter if it overlaps the goon. At the end of the day, the goon is in the background. It's not obscuring the goon's action. We can clearly identify that is the goon. So what's the problem? Why don't you do that? Come on, Brian, answer me. Why don't you do it? I know you're a subscriber. Now, for this page, there's one more example that I really wanted to point out, which is in panel 5. So if we look at the top line of Joker, it's such a shame you'll miss your father's debut, Miss Gordon. That word balloon tail is closer to the goon's head than the Joker's head. And you might think, oh, come on, John, you're just looking for stuff to complain about. And, well, yeah, that's kind of the point of this video. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. But I'm not nitpicking, I promise you, because when people are reading comics, they don't tend to linger on panels for very long. Like next time you read a comic, think about how long you actually do linger. Now, if you're a comic creator, you'll probably linger a little bit longer, because I think comic creators read comics slightly differently to non-comic creators, because we're sort of appreciating the craft while we read it. But that means that it's very plausible for someone to read panel 5 and think that, it's such a shame you'll miss your father's debut, Miss Gordon. Is the goon saying that? Because the word balloon tail is so close to his head. And because we're often looking at the art in our peripheral vision, because we're reading the dialogue, that includes where the word balloon tail is. So it's so important that we are really clear about who is talking and in what order. And I think throughout the entire comic, the Killing Joke gets this wrong. Everything else about the Killing Joke is iconic. I think the word balloons, it's not the dialogue, but the word balloons themselves, both in composition and especially word balloon tails, really lets it down. That's my hot take, I suppose, about the Killing Joke. It's otherwise great, but it could be better. When you start to really realize that your job as a comic creator is to make the words and the pictures harmonize, then you're going to start to notice word balloons a lot more in your own work and in other people's. You'll start to be able to spot the people who have really considered the word balloons and people who just sort of put them in there as an afterthought. And if that's all you take away from this video, amazing. You will have upgraded your skills as a comic creator a lot. Sometimes bad word balloon placement or bad word balloon choices is the result of the comic creator being way too pressed for time and just not having that time to quality check their word balloons. Sometimes it's just the nature of some working relationships that the word balloons get kicked to the curb. And there isn't that joined up thinking where the artist and the writer are harmonized. And sometimes, most often, it's because we just don't think about word balloons at all until it's too late. So, don't be that comic creator. Be the kind of comic creator who considers the word balloons right at the very start of your comic making process. And if you do that, you will make a better comic for your comic readers, and you won't find yourself needing to redraw or recreate panels to fit a word balloon in later. And if you want even more tips on how to improve your comic, then watch this video next.